So our last chapter of the semester is metabolism. In the simplest way I can say it, it explains why we have to breathe and why we have to eat. If I want to bring that to a more technical level, it turns out that in order to do what we do as living beings, we are constantly expending free energy. The fancy term for that symbol is delta G. You might see that or see it as free energy or Gibbs energy. Free in this case means that this energy is available for doing work. It's not free in the sense of doesn't cost us anything. It costs us a lot. We have all agriculture and living organisms other than humans also spend a lot of time getting food, and so it's not free in that sense. Turns out we can't do useful work just from taking the energy from warm objects, but we'll see how we get it when we do chemical reactions that have to do with food and with the oxygen we breathe. So free energy is consumed when we build things, we lift things, we speed up things. I mentioned the heat, so if we take some energy and convert it into heat, then we can't convert it back into free energy. Free energy can be lost, and for chemistry the most important part is reactions proceed in the direction that lowers free energy. So if we have a reaction that goes in a certain direction and reaches equilibrium, that means that we have a going downhill in the direction of lower free energy. I have some examples of sources of free energy and also where we're using it. So our primary source of free energy is the sun. There's a nuclear reaction going on there. Then there's secondary sources of free energy that are linked to that. If we have wind power, that's because parts of the earth are hotter and parts are colder, and then we have airflow there. We have oil and coal. Those are plant materials that grew millions of years ago and turned into oil and coal. The braking I mentioned is if you already spent some energy getting your car sped up, then you can use the energy when you brake and store it back into the battery if you have a hybrid car. Our most convenient energy is electricity, if you think about it. We can cook with it, we can heat our house with it, we can run our cell phones with it, we can light our room with it. We can basically do anything that we need with electricity. So that's the most convenient form. But if you ever have experienced a power outage, it's not easy to keep up the supply of electricity. So we'll compare that to the most convenient form of free energy that we have in our body in a second. But first I want to talk about what we can do with free energy. So we can order things. So here we have this on the top, all those Legos just in the big bin. And on the bottom we have a structure that was built from it that takes free energy. The analogy is if we have a bunch of amino acids and we want to make different proteins with the amino acids in exactly the right order, that takes free energy. Certainly anything that needs muscle power, so climbing up the stairs, is an obvious way where we need free energy for that. Communication, I mentioned the cell phone, needs to be charged every now and then. In our bodies, the fast communication is by the nerve cells. They use high concentrations of potassium and sodium in different compartments, and the communication is by opening up some channels, and then you have diffusion, very fast diffusion of these ions, and that's how the electrical impulses of nerves are made. After the neuron has fired, you have to get back those concentrations, and so you have to pump those sodiums and potassiums in the other direction, and that costs free energy. In fact, our brain, if we're at rest, takes about 20% of our energy, even though the tissue is not 20% of the total body mass. Here's some ways of storing free energy. There's a dam. So in the daytime, you can take solar energy to pump up water up the dam, and then at nighttime, if you need that energy, you can run generators with the water. There's a I guess a granola bar that would be for us some energy storage, right? So you can carry that in your backpack, and then if you're hungry, you can eat it. This doesn't work by itself, but you also need the oxygen that goes with it. There's gasoline, same idea. Car only works when you have oxygen. You can't run the car on the moon. I have the fire extinguisher because it's under pressure. So that's how we don't need a pump for pumping out the CO2 or whatever's in there to extinguish a fire, but it's under pressure and will come out by itself. And then there's the battery, where you can store energy, load it up, and then you can use it and then load it up again, recharge it. So how do we do that in our bodies? Our long-term storage in our body is fat. That's the most efficient way of storing energy, because fat is a pure, the fat cells only have the fat in them, nothing else. The starch needs some water to make it soluble, so it's a little bit less energy dense. But short term, and those are the molecules we'll talk about most, there's a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Similar to the gasoline where you need air or oxygen, for ATP you need water. So if you hydrolyze ATP, that releases free energy. The other one is called NADH, nicotinamide, and that is a redox molecule, and you need oxygen to utilize that. So we'll see those two molecules for short-term energy storage and for releasing the energy. So here's ATP. It has a group that's called adenosine, highly water soluble, and then it has 3 phosphates in a row here. This bond likes to break, and then we get phosphate, and we end up with adenosine diphosphate. We say this is a downhill reaction, the hydrolysis. That means that the equilibrium lies on the side of the products. And we can also say that by saying that the delta G, the change in free energy, is negative, and it happens to be about minus 50 kilojoule per mole. So every time you hydrolyze an ATP, you're wasting 50 kilojoule per mole of free energy unless you do something with it. Okay, here's the other reaction that will become important. NADH gets oxidized to NAD+. So this is the this is the NADH, the reduced form. If you oxidize that with oxygen, you get NAD+, and this gives you minus 220 kilojoule per mole. So about 4 times more than the hydrolysis of ATP. Forgot to mention, ATP is pretty stable in water, so only if you have a catalyst, and that's good, because otherwise you couldn't use it as energy storage. Same for the NADH. It's pretty slow in the absence of a catalyst, but if you have NADH and oxygen and a catalyst, then you have access to a lot of free energy. You might have heard that the mitochondria are the power stations of the cell. That's where most of the ATP synthesis happens. So in metabolism, we're interested in how food and oxygen react together to, in the end, make ATP. And then this ATP can be used to drive other reactions. So that's why we call it the short-term storage of energy. And our bodies have to continuously make ATP because we're continuously using it. We don't have to continuously eat because we have fat and sugar storage, so we can work off of those. But we do have to almost continuously breathe. We can do a short sprint without breathing, but that's it. And then we have to breathe because what runs most of these reactions that make ATP is oxidation of food. Okay, here's an overview of the metabolism. I'll make it a little bit bigger. We already saw that our 3 biomolecules that contain free energy or have calories are proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. There's a 4th biomolecule also important, that's nucleic acid, but that's not used to get energy out. That's the storage, that's the genetic information molecule. In the first stage, these molecules get hydrolyzed to smaller components. Proteins get hydrolyzed to amino acids, carbohydrates to simple sugars, fats into fatty acids and glycerol. And then they undergo different sets of reactions called metabolism to end up with a common intermediate molecule, which is acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is really acidic acid, which has a little tag on it, the CoA. So it has 2 carbons, and most of the carbons and amino acids and simple sugars and fatty acids and glycerol end up as this 2-carbon molecule. We won't talk about these steps, but what we will talk about is what's shown on the other side. How the citric acid cycle eventually turns into CO2. So that's oxidizing it to CO2. That's where the CO2 comes from that we breathe out. In fact, of all the carbon that leaves the body that was integrated into cells first comes out as us breathing out CO2. So that's the first step. And as we're doing that, we're making lots of NADH. That NADH reacts with oxygen in a process called oxidative phosphorylation and electron transport. And that is the process that makes most of the ATP and happens. Actually, both of these things happen in the mitochondria, citric acid cycle and the electron transport. Okay. So I'm going to tell you this story backwards now. It's sort of, in order to do this, we have to do this, and by the way, then we also have to do this. So the process that makes most of the ATP is by something called the ATP synthase, and it makes ATP from ADP and phosphate. That's an uphill reaction, and it uses the free energy from a proton gradient. We'll see what that is across the membrane. So there's more protons on one side than on the other side, and that drives the synthesis of ATP. So how do we get that proton gradient? It takes free energy to make it. We get that through the electron transfer chain. That builds up that proton gradient, and it does so by using the free energy from oxidizing NADH with oxygen. So that's where the NADH is necessary and the oxygen is necessary. No food yet. Where do we get the NADH from? We get that by oxidizing food to CO2, and at the same time the NAD plus is reduced to NADH. Okay, so it's sort of 3-step process. Each process depends on the other process, and only in concert, when they work in concert, does the whole thing work. Okay, I'm going to give you an overview of the citric acid cycle, and then we'll discuss it in further detail in class. So we're coming in with this molecule acetyl-CoA. It has 2 carbons. That's what we need to focus on right now. And there's a molecule called oxaloacetate that has 4 carbons, and they fuse together to make citric acid. Citric acid is what gives this cycle the name. Then citric acid gets oxidized. 1 CO2 gets removed, gets produced, and an NAD plus gets oxidized to NADH. Then it gets oxidized again from this 5-carbon molecule to the 4-carbon molecule, and another molecule of CO2. Again, we're making some NADH. Then there's a process that makes some ATP. We'll see that, the details of that. and we're oxidizing again, this time without giving off CO2, and oxidizing again. So we're getting another molecule of NADH, and we're getting a molecule of FADH2, which is also a reduced molecule. Then we're back at the oxaloacetate that we started out with, right? And so in the process of going through the cycle one time, we're making 2 molecules of CO2, because all of these steps are oxidations. We get lots of reduction steps at the same time, so we're making all these NADHs and FADHs as we're going through this. So in class I will go through the details, and we'll talk a bit about what is oxidation and reduction as we're looking at these molecules. Of course, you don't have to remember all these steps. You'll have them available at your fingertips looking at the slides or looking at the video. But we want to see the big picture, and I'll say that once again. The citric acid cycle is the part of metabolism that produces the CO2 that we breathe out. That's the part that gets oxidized. If something gets oxidized, something has to be reduced. These electron carriers, they're called, get reduced, so we're getting a lot of NADH and FADH2, which is used in the next step. Okay, I'll leave it at this part, and we can discuss the details on Monday in class.